Welcome to the Icon Church Leadership Podcast. My name is Justin Anderson. I'm the lead pastor at Icon Church, and this is Ilona Trofimovich, our Director of Operations. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, doesn't she usually start these things? And the answer is yes. But today, I am the host. I am in control, finally, of what we are doing.
Okay.
Today, we are continuing in season 2 of our podcast where we are going through kind of in a parallel fashion with our sermon series, A Rule for Life, and we are looking at different spiritual disciplines that the church has practiced for many, many years. And this week, we are talking about Sabbath, which is why I am the host and she is the expert today, because Miss Ilona has done a lot of work on Sabbath, or as she calls it, Shabbat.
All right.
And so we thought it would be fun to flip the script this week and have her be the host. Or me be the host, and she's the expert. So that's what we're doing. All right. I'm killing this so far. Ilona, let's talk about Sabbath. Let's start by saying what Sabbath isn't, because I think there's probably some confusion about what Sabbath is and isn't. So let's start with what it isn't.
Yeah, I think the confusion comes because it's antiquated and not something that a lot of people have done in practice. And so I think important to remind ourselves of some of those things. Sabbath isn't just this day off to kind of do whatever, or just to sit around and be lazy and do nothing. That really resonated.
I'm disappointed in that. That's news to me. Keep going.
Yeah, but I think it's important. It's not just a day off. It's not just a day to do nothing, because I think a lot of people don't like the idea of Sabbath just because they're like, well, I'm just going to be bored. Like, I don't want to sit around and not do anything all day. And so I think that's an important distinction to make, is that Sabbath actually does have a purpose. And I think probably the most important thing to consider is Sabbath isn't passive in the sense of, again, like sitting around not doing anything. I think the only way that we can ever effectively Sabbath is when we make sure that we've planned and prepared for it. And I think this is a big thing in my own life of learning how to Sabbath and actually keep it a rhythm, is you have to prep for it. Sabbath isn't something you can just passively hope is going to be okay on your Friday or your Saturday or whatever day you do it. But it's something you prep for in the same way that you would prep for a vacation or a holiday. Like when you think about Christmas, like you get ready for Christmas Day. And you plan, you prep, you buy stuff, you make sure that you're ready so that you can just wake up Christmas morning and you're not running to the grocery store and you're not unloading the dishwasher. Like you're ready for that moment. And so I think that's super important, is that Sabbath is something we prepare for, we anticipate. And I think when we change our mindset that Sabbath is like a really good thing, it's a blessing, then that excitement can come in and actually make us want to prepare for that moment.
Sure. Do I get to not see anybody on Sabbath?
I think there's an issue of people thinking that Sabbath is synonymous with solitude, which it doesn't have to be. I think there are moments when a Sabbath feels really restful, when it is kind of me kind of having a moment or taking a long walk by myself. But I think especially when we think about like families, or just the fact that we are relational people and we're meant to be in community, Sabbath is not a mandatory solitude each week. I think if anything, we do some of our best celebration when we're with other people and we get to kind of celebrate and have joy together.
Okay, so you said the word celebrate. So let's talk about then what Sabbath is, or why. Like, let's start with why. Why should we Sabbath? Why is it a necessary thing? Is it just because we need a break? Is it just because we work super hard? Why?
Yeah, I mean, first, because it's a biblical command. Like, I think that's the part that always makes me laugh about Sabbath is it's one of the 10 commandments. It's one of the commandments that has like the most real estate in the scripture. Like, God says a lot about that commandment of like, observe the Sabbath, keep it holy, gives us context for it. And we're not tossing out any of the other 10 commandments unless you're going,
I've got some, I'd nominate, but.
All right, so I think that's one thing to consider, is like we aren't tossing out other commands. Like, this is supposed to be something that God instituted for us. God took rest on the seventh day. So I think part of the why has to be grounded just in that truth. And then I think anecdotally, all of us can acknowledge that when we just work and we don't take a break and we don't rest, like we don't do quality work. And I think it's part of God's design that he instituted an ordinance that would make us actually work better, that I can work better the other 6 days because I've taken a day to rest, to rejoice, to celebrate in what I've done. And I think that's a really important way that God designed us. And it's not because work is bad, it's so that we can celebrate in the work that we actually did.
Yeah, so talk about that, because I think sometimes people think about it as we work really hard for 6 days and man, thank God that's over, and TGIF and all of that, which I say all the time.
In that voice too.
Yep. And then it's like, oh, thank God we got Saturday coming or Sunday coming or whatever our Sabbath is. Is that the right way to think about it and the relationship between Sabbath and work?
I don't think that that's really helpful, because I don't think Scripture posits work and Sabbath against each other. I think they're meant to work in tandem. They're meant to complement one another, that we need both, and to only value one or the other isn't actually what it means to be fully human. Like, God calls us, and we see this in the Genesis account, like God calls us to work and calls us to rest. Like, we see both of those things. And so I think that's really important for us to remember, is like work and rest aren't enemies. Like, they're meant to work together.
Right, good. That's great. I love that. Let's talk now about what Sabbath is, because we've got the negatives out of the way. We've got the relationship to work, which I think will play in more. I think that's a big idea. How do we Sabbath? What do we Sabbath? What is it? What do we do?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to consider with Sabbath, and again, back to the scripture on this, is that God instituted the day, like he made the seventh day holy, is what Genesis tells us. And so I think Sabbath is helpful to remind ourselves that, like, this is a day to celebrate what is holy in my ordinary life. Like, it's a day to find joy in family and in friends, and the fact that, like, I'm gonna wake up and be happy that I got a full night's sleep, or things like that. It's a moment to just pause and celebrate and be joyful in that. And I think particularly in a cultural moment right now, where in the midst of a global pandemic with COVID, like, that's a day to wake up and remind myself, like, wow, I can find such joy in these ordinary things. Like, our whole series of, like, peace needs a Sabbath, it needs a pause, because we need to be reminded, like, we are good. Like, life can be good, and I can find contentment. And sometimes it is especially in those ordinary things that we can find that level of joy and rest, and really celebrating what we have.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So it's celebrating, kind of taking a moment to pause and recognizing what we have. That's great. What else?
I think it's important to think about Sabbath as the climax of the week. I think that, for me, was a really important shift when I started really trying to, like, regiment a habit of this. Because I think when you look at Sabbath and you're just like, oh, it's just the break from all the other stuff that I did, it kind of downplays it in terms of, like, what is actually more important and significant. And so I think when we look towards Sabbath, again, like that idea of, like, anticipation, it's the holiday, it's the great day, I think it changes the way that we even think about its purpose. Like, Sabbath is meant to be, again, anticipatory in the sense of, like, it is good in itself, and it provides us an opportunity to remind ourselves, like, God is running the world. And so, like, I look forward to Sabbath because I will, like, struggle my 6 days of work and then get to Sabbath and remember, like, God's running the world without me. And if anything, my other 6 days were just, like, my sad attempt at, like, controlling the little universe that I have.
Yeah.
And the Sabbath reminds me, like, no, God is in control always, and especially Sabbath forces that reminder.
Yeah, I feel like one of the benefits of Sabbath for me, and for a lot of people, you know, most of my friends are not lazy people that look forward to Sabbath because it's like, finally I get to do nothing, right? Like, I think it's a challenge to us to recognize and live into the fact that my contribution to this world is significant, but and also, in a sense, not significant, right? Like, it's significant and not dependent. The world is not dependent upon me. God is not dependent upon me. The world will go on without me, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's like a blow to my ego in a good, healthy way, that when I stop, the world doesn't stop along with it.
Yeah, and I think that would probably be the last thing I would say about what Sabbath is that idea, I feel like, is really countercultural. I think our society builds up this idea that I am running the world, I am the one in control, I'm crafting my dream of reality, and I think what Sabbath reminds us is that that's not the case. And if anything, it helps kind of push us off that eternal hamster wheel that's always telling us, like, I need to have more, I need to be seeking more. And the kind of consumer narrative of, like, I don't have enough, and so I have to keep working, I have to keep striving, which really is just a cover for, like, our own human frailty of just acknowledging, like, I really am not enough. And I think that's the beauty of Sabbath, is it's a weekly reminder I need this. Like, I need to rest. I am not God. I'm not sovereign. Like, my body is weak and frail. And so I think that's the really important thing about Sabbath is it forces us to remember that, which is like doubly important in our society, which all around us is telling us you can do anything that you want. And Sabbath is like, actually, you can't. Remind yourself who can. And I think that's a really important thing that Sabbath teaches us every week.
Yeah. And I think it's important to think about like, what are we filling that day with, right? So what are we filling it with in terms of tasks? What are we filling it with in terms of activity? But also, what are we filling it with emotionally, right? And I found that it creates really helpful space for me to cultivate thankfulness and celebration. I am not good at those things. I tend to go, okay, that's done. Now let's move. What's next? What's the next thing? And an entire day of no productivity creates space I need to be able to stop and go, okay, let's look backwards to what God has done this week that we can now rest from, what God has done through us, what God has done in spite of us, right? It creates space to stop and be thankful about the past and then anticipate the future. Anticipate, okay, this is what God's going to do. If this is what he did last week, can you imagine what he's going to do in this coming week? And it just creates that pause that otherwise I won't build into my life. It's almost like God knows us. And
like he made us.
It's almost like that, like he created the world for us. So Sabbath, Jesus says famously, like, God made the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? That it's for us because we need it, not that we're enslaved to it. Okay, so let's get practical then. How do we do this? Because if I'm totally honest, our family is terrible at this. Oftentimes, Saturday, which is our Sabbath day, is the most tension-filled, argument-filled, stressful day of my week. And Emily and I get to the end of the week, end of Sabbath, and go, "This is a terrible idea. We should stop Sabbathing."
Yikes!
And that's, I'm going to say, not the answer.
That's probably not the
So
answer.
help us, coach us. How do we Sabbath more effectively?
Yeah, and I think, part of that, of what you're addressing, is the idea of like establishing healthy expectations for what Sabbath is going to be like. And I think, in terms of like life stage and all of that, we can talk about that in a second. But what I found really helpful is to kind of set a frame, and Pete Scazzero's got this great kind of 4-word frame for a way to spend Sabbath, to think about the activities you do or don't do. And he talks about stopping, resting, delighting, and contemplating. So when he says stop, like literally stop working, which I think is a really important thing for Sabbath, and that's like the paid work and the unpaid work. I think in the years that I've been trying to figure out this practice, it's meant asking the question of like, do I budget on a Saturday? Like on a Sabbath, do I do laundry? Do I go grocery shopping? And really just having to have that moment to ask myself, like, do I need to do this, or is me doing this because I'm still, and kind of what we just talked about, like functioning out of this idea of like, I have to work to keep the world moving. And Sabbath really instead is meant to be that act of trust, to say like, I can pause for these 24 hours and trust that God's going to take care of it.
What about parenting? Can I stop doing that on Sabbath?
I would say probably not. Like, don't lock your kids and put them in a closet or something.
She's the expert, guys.
Yeah, that's good. We're going to write this down.
Okay, so stop.
Yeah, stop. I think rest. So like, think about activities that actually give you life, that rejuvenate you. So maybe that's taking a nap. Maybe that's going for a hike. I think in the context of families, like really being able to have the conversation with your kids of like, what's going to make us like have fun and feel rested today? And to that point of like you and Emily sitting down at the end of the night to say like, yeah, were those activities that maybe were fun but not restful, and being willing to kind of have that conversation and say like, okay, there's still some parsing out that needs to be done. And there's part of it, and this maybe sounds bad, but there are people I don't spend my Sabbath with because like you might be a fun person, but it's not going to be restful.
Was that you made a motion towards me?
But there are certain people that I'm like that interaction might be totally like good. They might be a great relationship, but they're just not going to be a restful person that day. And I'm going to end the day maybe more tired because it was actually an act of giving and serving and caring for someone. Which again is the nuance of this. I don't know that there's going to be a black and white answer. And I think if anything, the joy of Sabbath for me has been like figuring this out as the years go on. So yeah, it would be stopping and resting, delighting, which I think is like finding joy in those things. And I think, just to ask your question of like, does this make me feel like happy, and am I having fun in that? And I think as part of that is that last piece of like contemplation. Not like the goal of Sabbath isn't to numb ourselves into not having to think about like how hard the work week was, or like to not have to deal with the hard things in life. I think if anything, it should be like retuning our heart to God and reminding ourselves of what is good and what is like valuable and satisfying in our lives. And that I would argue that any Sabbath activity should have that be one of the end goals. Like it's gonna make me think about God. It's gonna help me worship God better.
Cool. One of the things we have in our notes here is to cultivate whimsy. I kill it with whimsy, personally.
Yeah, this office is just so whimsical.
It's a very whimsical life that we have. So one of the things that our family got some advice that without telling the kids like all the details, to just ask all of our kids like, okay, if you could do anything today, what would you do? And let them just answer that question, not telling them that whatever they say, we're going to do. Right? And so you're taking a little bit of a calculated risk here. And we did that a couple weeks ago on our Sabbath. We were sitting at breakfast and just asked all the kids, and they all had different answers. Thankfully, none of them said go to Disney World. Because after we told them, oh, okay, well, we're going to do everything you guys just said, they're like, like we should have asked for a pony. And so
pony. Kids still ask for those?
My kids do.
Okay.
And so we did it. We, everything they asked for, we did. And so my son asked to play catch, play baseball. One of my daughters said that they wanted to go up to the Space Needle. And so we did. We took them to the Space Needle. It's super expensive. Just take one of your kids at a time. But it was really fun, like a fun day to just go, hey, let's do what you guys want to do. And I felt like that really cultivated some whimsy in our family.
You had fun.
It was great.
That was a good Sabbath.
It was very whimsical. Okay, so we are all in different stages. I have a family with 5 kids. You are currently single as we're recording. Who knows what the future holds?
Dream big. I mean, wow. I quit. Just kidding.
How do we think about Sabbath differently relative to our life stage?
Okay. It's a great question because and I wake up on my so I try to Sabbath Friday night to Saturday night. And I wake up on my Saturday mornings and I will admit that I'm so glad I don't have 5 screaming children right now. Like I get to stay in bed.
Why do you assume my children are screaming?
I didn't say that they were your 5 screaming children. I just said in general, I don't want screaming children. And I think that's there's a blissfulness to that, and at the same time, I didn't get to see the look on my child's face when they're like, oh my gosh, I get to go to the Space Needle. I think there's the key to find joy in both, but I think again, back to the expectations. I think when we have an attempt at Sabbath, especially if we've never done it before, we just have to be honest about what can I do? And again, those 4 words of stopping, resting, delighting, contemplating, Can I find a moment and an opportunity to really do that within the course of just my life? And so as a single person, I have a lot of flexibility of what I do. I would maybe mostly say to the single people, that's why you shouldn't have Sabbath and solitude as synonymous, because then I think we can get really stingy with that moment of celebration and joy and realize no, you have family and community and relationships where you can still cultivate that as well. I think parents, particularly of young children, are going to have to figure out what works for our family. And we always say this at Icon, of the idea of begin where you are and take the next step. If I'm a family that has newborn twins, the way that I Sabbath is not going to be the way that my Sabbath gets to look as a 20-something who's single. You just kind of have to, I think, establish that expectation. But I think that's why one of my favorite lines to filter a Sabbath is this restful and is it worshipful? And I think all of us, regardless of life stage, can filter that line through a Sabbath.
It's great. It's great. So let's wrap this up by kind of pivoting to what you're going to do next. And Ilona just said, we always talk about, begin where you are, take the next step. Consider what in your life and in life stage Sabbath might look like. And I would encourage you with kids, or you're single, or no matter what, you got to make a plan. If you don't make a plan, it's not going to happen, right? Like this thing doesn't happen organically. It's difficult, requires discipline and sacrifice like anything in your life. So make a plan that is you stopping, resting, delighting, and contemplating. So thank you for joining us. I hope my hosting didn't ruin the whole thing. Thank you, Ilona, for your wisdom on Shabbat. Wherever you are, wherever you listen to this, I would love it if you guys would share this, rate it, make comments on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you download your podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. To see our show notes and other episodes, head to iconchurch.org/leadership podcast.